There are three people primarily responsible for the incredible sound of Oasis during the 90s. On vocals we have Liam Gallagher, the songwriter and the guitarist Noel Gallagher, and thirdly we have the man without whom Oasis would probably be still playing tiny pub gigs in Burnage, Manchester, producer Owen Morris, the fifth Beatle of Oasis. There were of course only 4 Beatles, but many people have been given the title of fifth Beatle, including actual fifth Beatles Stuart Sutcliffe, Pete Best, Jimmy Nicol, Chas Newby, Tony Sheridan, Andy White, Billy Preston, and the Don himself, Eric Clapton, in the 60s. However, for me personally, there can only really be one fifth Beatle, only one artist who influenced and helped create their sound on an equal footing to Lennon and McCartney, and that is producer George Martin, for whom the word legendary is still too small a word. George Martin produced every Beatles album except for one. He would tell them no, he would suggest different ideas, he would include production tricks that were bizarre, new and revolutionary for the time in which they lived. He played piano or harmonium or harpsichord or organ on every single Beatles album except for one. The one album George Martin neither played on nor produced was Let It Be, which was produced by Phil Spector and which is particularly notable for sounding quite different to all the other albums and being absolutely loathed by one Mr. Paul McCartney. So much so that he actually re-released the entire album in 2003 with all of Phil Spector's production elements completely removed. He called it Let It Be Naked. And that is just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to how fundamentally important the production and the vision that producer George Martin brought to the table were. When he first heard the Beatles, they were pretty much a garage band, but a garage band with a spark, with potential. When he heard them, he didn't just hear what they sounded like then, he heard potential, he heard what they could sound like, and he made it happen. Now, let's talk about Oasis. In May 1993, Alan McGee saw Oasis play live at King Tut's Wah Wah Hut in Glasgow. They played a 4-song set: Rock and Roll Star, Bring It On Down, Up in the Sky and I Am the Walrus. And anyone who knows Oasis knows that those are 4 songs in which the band sound absolutely massive. Alan McGee signed Oasis to Creation Records on the basis of that massive live sound. And towards the end of that same year, he booked them in to Monnow Valley Studios in Wales to begin work recording their first studio album, Definitely Maybe. They were recording with producer Dave Batchelor, but the sessions didn't go well and they didn't have the punch of the live sound for which they had been signed. Subsequently, the first recording sessions at Monnow Valley were rejected both by the band and the record company. The Monnow Valley sessions were abandoned, and to this day only one of the Monnow Valley recordings has ever actually been released, and that is Bring It On Down, Monnow Valley version, which is only available as an extra 13th track on disc 1 of the Japanese edition of the Definitely Maybe 3 CD re-release in 2014. Other than that, nothing else from these sessions has ever seen the light of day. After abandoning the first doomed recording of Definitely Maybe at Monnow Valley, the band attempted to go to Amsterdam in January of 1994. They got on a ferry, caused a massive fight, largely started by Liam, and every member of the group was arrested and deported back to England on arrival, except for Noel, who had been asleep the whole time. After this disastrous ferry trip across the channel and back again, the band got together in Sawmill's studio in Cornwall to attempt recording Definitely Maybe for the second time. This time, however, in an effort to recapture that all-important live sound for which they had been signed, they did it without a producer. They just had Noel and Mark Coyle, who was their live sound engineer. Realising that the previous sessions at Monnow Valley had sounded kind of weak and thin and a bit empty, they took a slightly different approach, which was to record the drums, bass and rhythm guitars as a backing track, after which Noel Gallagher would just layer up and layer up and layer up track after track after track of guitar. Noel would just overdub and overdub and overdub until the songs were just a swamp of competing guitar layers. Now the tracks themselves, the actual musical content of what they recorded, was pretty good on the part of the band and great on the part of Noel, but they didn't have a producer. So they recorded these tracks, they mixed them, and once again they got rejected because they simply weren't good enough. And at this point, serious panic began to set in. Now the mixes from the Sawmill sessions, this second recording of Definitely Maybe, they've never been officially released, but they have been leaked and can be listened to, at least at the time of recording, on YouTube. They're called the Whitfield Street Sessions, named for the London studios where the mixes of the second recording of the album were made. Married with Children isn't on there, as that was recorded as an acoustic demo in Mark Coyle's bedroom. Supersonic isn't on there, and neither is Shaker Maker, because according to Dave Batchelor, both of these were recorded at the Pink Museum Studios in Liverpool, so they were from a separate session. The remaining 8 tracks from Definitely Maybe on the Whitfield Street Sessions are Rock and Roll Star, Live Forever, Up in the Sky, Columbia, Bring It On Down, Cigarettes and Alcohol, Digsy's Dinner, and Slide Away. And they are a fascinating listen, because they are actually, by and large, exactly the same tracks that made it onto the final mix of Definitely Maybe. But they're particularly interesting because they sound absolutely bloody awful. At least to someone who's used to listening with a producer's ear and a studio musician's ear, they sound bad. Digsy's Dinner and Slide Away are particularly just dreadful. They contain all the tracks in the incredible final mix of Definitely Maybe, but because they were made without a producer, without an expert putting together the mix, shaping the final product, they just sound like a garage band. They sound like the Beatles might have sounded without George Martin at the helm. The Whitfield Street version of Cigarettes and Alcohol is another really good example. Tony McCarroll and Noel Gallagher, they go out of time with each other on the intro. When Noel's playing the riff and the bass drum comes in, they go out of time. Now this mess up, as many of Tony McCarroll's mess ups were, is brilliantly masked by Owen Morris in the final mix of Definitely Maybe, but it's glaringly, cringe-makingly obvious in this very, very exposed version of the mix. And in this vocal version of the mix, Liam also clearly sings, "Is it my imagination, or have I finally found something worth licking for?" Listening to the Whitfield Street mixes of Definitely Maybe, it is no wonder Creation rejected the second recording. They had now spent serious money recording the album twice. So as a desperate last-ditch attempt, Marcus Russell from Creation contacted Owen Morris. Marcus Russell told him, "You can do whatever you like with these stems, literally whatever you want." And Noel was at this point completely burned out and on the verge of giving up. So, as a result, Owen Morris had an unusually free rein in mixing the album. Morris's initial reaction to hearing the stems recorded at Sawmill Studio was, and I quote, "They have really messed up here." Creation were not willing to fund a third complete re-record of Definitely Maybe, so Owen Morris began to work at shaping something out of the tracks recorded at Sawmills. While he couldn't re-record the whole album, he was able to re-record some of the vocals, which he did, getting much better takes. Where there was out of time playing, which unfortunately there was a lot of when it came to the drums, he would mask it or bury it under other instruments or noise. Have you ever wondered why there's so much just raucous amp noise at the beginning of Cigarettes and Alcohol? It covers up the bass drum going out of time with the guitar. Morris also adjusted the EQ of the bass playing, rolling off treble and definition from the top end of the notes so that you could hear that the bass was there, it was being played, but because it sat quite low in the mix and because he'd rolled off all those upper high frequencies, you couldn't hear how inaccurately and badly it was actually being played. One of the other major things Owen Morris was able to do was to pick and choose the tracks he liked best from all the millions and millions of guitar overdubs that Noel had done in the Sawmill sessions. There was apparently a phone conversation with Noel where Owen rang him and said, "Which guitar solo am I using?" And Noel just said, "What do you mean?" And he said, "There's like 12 guitar solos here, which one is it?" And Noel just went, "All of them." Owen Morris, however, had a healthy disregard for what the band wanted, preferring rather to focus on the big picture. The main thing that everyone wanted was just simply an album that sounded excellent. So he simply picked and chose the guitar lines that worked best to his ear and either discarded the rest or buried them in the mix to add some texture. Morris's open disregard for the power dynamics in the band as well actually really worked in the band's favour. He would openly tell Noel if he thought something was crap. He would constantly turn Noel down and Bonehead up in the mix. But in doing so, he was taking the first steps in doing what the band, the management and the record company had all been looking for from day one, which was how to replicate the band's live sound. But there was still one more magical element that Owen Morris introduced, and that was something called a brick wall limiter. A brick wall limiter is a bit like a lid on a mix. If you've ever seen waveforms of sound, you see they go up and down. They're a bit like a heartbeat on a hospital monitor. You've got the ups and the downs. A brick wall limiter is effectively a lid, so that as the waveform goes up, it hits it and stays at that ceiling every time it hits it. All the highest points and loudest moments are reduced down to the volume level that you put that lid at. This avoids getting unpleasant bursts of volume or kind of distracting lurches in the song's dynamics. But what Morris did was he took brick wall limiting to its absolute outer limits extreme. So he set the limit bar here, and then he got the mix and turned it right up so that constantly the whole mix was fighting against the lid of the limiter. And interestingly, this was the final icing on the cake, because that's exactly what the human ear does in a live situation. With the final addition of the brick wall limiter, he had not only achieved but actually enhanced the magical live sound of the band for which they had been signed in the first place. Here's a quote from music journalist John Harris. "The miracle was that music that had passed through so many hands sounded so dynamic. The guitar-heavy stew that Morris had inherited had been remoulded into something positively pile-driving." Can you imagine what would have happened to Definitely Maybe without Owen Morris? The Whitfield Street mixes are very, very average. Oasis just wouldn't have happened. For many of us, the 90s would have been utterly changed. Without Morris, a whole decade of British culture would have failed to change history. Owen Morris stayed on as the band's sound engineer and producer. He was, in my view, equally responsible, next to Noel, for the creation of the band's finest moment, which was What's the Story? Morning Glory. There's a big contrast between the recording of Definitely Maybe and the recording of Morning Glory. They recorded Morning Glory in 10 days flat. And this time they really did get the balance right. Record quick, record lots, keep it human, keep it natural, and don't be too perfectionist. They spent just 10 days recording What's the Story? Morning Glory, and get this, 6 weeks mixing it. This time round, they had learned. They knew where it mattered to spend the time. The mix was, and still is, far, 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 far more important than the initial recording. 10 days recording versus 6 weeks mixing. The mix is where perfectionism matters much more and can be a real asset. Next came Oasis's third album, Be Here Now, where the whole band and Morris were completely off their faces on drugs pretty much the whole time, Morris snorting lines of cocaine off the mixing desk while recording. Sadly, in my opinion, mainly due to the drugs, Be Here Now didn't fulfill its potential and top Morning Glory. And after Be Here Now, probably because of Be Here Now in fact, Morris and Oasis went their separate ways. After that, Bonehead left, Quigsy left, and Liam's voice underwent some significant changes. And at that point, Oasis went into their second phase as a band. I honestly felt that Oasis were never the same again. Just like the bar chord rhythm playing of Bonehead that dominated the sound of Definitely Maybe was an indispensable ingredient of the Oasis sound, so was Morris's magic touch. Owen Morris was as fundamentally important to their signature sound as George Martin was to the sound of the Beatles. Morris could answer back to Noel unapologetically. He had a producer's ear in a way none of the official band members ever really did. And without him, to me, Oasis were never really properly the truest form of Oasis ever again. Personally, I feel that the biggest difference between Oasis in the 90s and Oasis in the noughties can be summed up in just two words. Owen Morris, the fifth Beatle of Oasis.